Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to welcome you to Kelly Cawthorn's webinar today. If you don't know me, I am Carrie Linderoth, and I'm a partner here at Kelly Cawthorn, and I am a newly added board member to the Citizens Research Council, and I'm really proud of a lot of the work they've been putting together and wanted to introduce my friends so they could have a discussion with regard to road funding. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric Lufer, who's the president of the Citizens Research Council, to say hello and introduce Eric Dennis. Take it away, Eric.
Good morning. Well, I guess it's technically afternoon now. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having us. I'm here to give you a brief introduction. The Citizens Research Council, if you don't know us, is a private, non-for-profit public policy organization that works to make the state a better place to live, work, do business. We tackle public policy issues in a very independent, nonpartisan way. We're not trying to grow government. We're not trying to shrink government. We're trying to have it work better. We do that by doing deep dive analysis of public policy issues, following the facts, trying to put those out. So policymakers, whether that's state or local government, but also the citizens understand the issues better and can make better informed decisions about them. About 4 years ago, we got some funding, short-term funding to really dig into infrastructure issues. Prior to that, a lot of our work was just about the financing of infrastructure issues, and clearly the financing, where the money comes from is part of it, but how that money is used, uh, what's being done on the infrastructure side is more than just how much money do you have to um, throw at it. With that funding, we were able to hire Eric Paul Dennis, and you can see his credentials there. He enjoyed school for a while and stuck around, got several degrees from Michigan State, U of M, did some work in the field, engineering and urban planning type work, and then had the chance to come to us and do the public policy analysis. Before I turn it over to Eric, I want to emphasize the part that the funding that we got to hire Eric was short term. So we're looking to bolster that funding, be able to keep sustaining the work that he's doing. So if you value that, if you go onto our website, crcmich.org, and see some of the other stuff and are able to contribute to keep us doing that, it is greatly appreciated. With that, Eric,
Well,
yeah,
I have
go
one
ahead.
quick thing to jump in on too. Sorry to interrupt you, but we do have a Q&A box as part of this webinar. And if you have questions that come up during Eric's presentation, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that they get addressed time permitting as this webinar moves forward. So we appreciate you joining us today. Thank you. And back to you, Eric.
Uh, no, Eric Dennis, take it away.
All right, so thank you everyone for being here. So my initial plan was to focus this webinar on the recent road funding package, which we will cover. However, Carrie sent me some of your preliminary questions, and thank you for those questions, those of you who sent some in, because they convinced me to kind of expand the scope of this webinar, which I think will make this more interesting for you as well as actually for me. I will warn you, this is going to be kind of an information dense presentation. We're going to cover a lot of material fairly quickly. But what I decided to do when we're done here this afternoon, I'm going to send Carrie a PDF version of these slides to redistribute to attendees. So you don't have to worry too much about taking copious notes or screenshots. You'll get a copy of these slides. And most of these slides will have references with hyperlinks down in the footers down here. So when you get the PDF version, you can click on these and learn more about any topics that catch your interest. So a few of the questions, preliminary questions that I received were about how Michigan's roads compare to other states in terms of condition and quality. It just so happens that I've spent a lot of time looking into this. Usually when you see states list ordered or ranked for road quality, it's based on a single metric that somebody found and quite simply just published as a simple list. But there are a lot of metrics out there There's a lot of different ways that you can think about the condition of a road and different ways to evaluate that. So we at CRC developed an index scoring methodology that combines several base metrics to get a more comprehensive view. Doing this required some analytical judgment. I selected 5 basic metrics that I determined would assess road conditions as completely as possible without getting too complicated. I also assessed each of these 5 metrics by both good and poor condition, because both are important. If you are a state that has a lot of bridges or pavement in good condition, that's good. But if you also have a lot of infrastructure in poor condition, that's bad, and probably means you're not cost effectively maintaining your infrastructure in fair condition. So let's go over these kind of quickly. The first metric that we looked at is bridge condition as reported to the National Bridge Inventory, and this covers basically all public roads. All publicly owned bridges within each state are assessed by the Federal Highway Administration through the National Bridge Inventory. As far as roadway pavement, there's actually no data set that covers all public roads. The best we can do is the Federal Aid Eligible, or FAE network. In Michigan, this is about a third of our roads, 33% by system mile, centerline mile. But that third of roads carries over 90% of our traffic. So we're still covering nearly all of where actually people drive by assessing the FAE network. And this metric assesses pavement roughness, typically reported through a standardized metric called the International Roughness Index, or IRI. The third metric is average daily traffic by roughness on the National Highway System. So this is assessing not only pavement condition, but it's considering how many vehicles drive over that pavement. And the National Highway System, or NHS, is a subset of the federal aid network that includes all of our expressways, as well as most of our major thoroughfares. In Michigan, this is actually only about 5% of our network by centerline mile, but the NHS system carries more than 50% of all of our traffic. The final 2 metrics use a standard federal pavement condition metric, abbreviated as PCM. And again, we're looking at the National Highway System, and in this case, it is, we assess separately interstate routes on the National Highway System and non-interstate routes. This is basically because this is how the data gets to us. So long story short, I take a lot of raw data provided by the Federal Highway Administration and do some math and come up with an index score for each variable that reflects the range of data across all 50 states and combine them all together. So here are the results. So starting from the left, I'm showing component index scores reflecting each of the 5 metrics in both good and poor condition. When we get all the way to the right, I've got the final index score, which is a simple average of the components as well as the state rank. And I focused on the index scores in this table because I think it's actually more important to look at the index score than the state rank, because states can kind of bunch in the middle. So for example, here's Michigan ranking 40th, but by our index score, which reflects the base metrics, we're actually much closer to the 30th state than the 50th state. And again, when you get these slides, you can click on these links in the footer and find all of the details and the analysis that went into this. And I've done something similar to look at Michigan's road funding compared to other states. So our analysis covers a decade of funding from 2013 to 2022. Unfortunately, there's always a few years of time lag from when this data is collected to when it is reported by the feds. So this analysis uses data that's already a few years old, but it is the most recent available from the federal level. So if we want to compare states, this is the most recent we have to work with. Now, if you want to fairly compare Michigan's road funding levels to other states, this is a much more complicated question than you might initially expect. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about our methodology, but I want to point out there's a lot of financial data available, and there are a lot of options for how you might evaluate that data. So if you're not careful, you can get a result that misrepresents what's going on. For example, there are analyses out there that shows Michigan ranks dead last in road funding. One way this has been done was by taking a subset of financial data from the Census Bureau, specifically capital outlays, and dividing that by state population. We also do this, and it is true that Michigan ranks very low by this method of evaluation, even dead last in some years. But you won't get the same result with other data sources or other methods of evaluation that are just as valid. And we wanted to be as comprehensive and objective as practical, but still provide a simple result with a single ranking. So we combined multiple data sources, normalized or evaluated in multiple ways. This table is showing an index score and ranking for each of 4 methods of normalization or methods of evaluation. The final tally is over to the right. So for example, if you take Michigan's road funding per centerline mile of public road, Michigan ranks 26th. And that might surprise you because we usually think of Michigan as ranking very low. But those rankings that rank Michigan low usually normalize funding by population. There we rank 39th, but that's actually more related to population density than road funding. You can see that even states that rank quite high in overall road funding tend to rank low if they are fairly dense urbanized states like New York or New Jersey. So the overall index score is just a simple average of the 4 component index scores. And if we average Michigan's index scores together, Michigan ranks 28th over this decade of data evaluated. One thing I want to point out is that even though I used 10 years of data, in this methodology, I wanted to emphasize the most recent funding trends. So the most recent 3 years of data, so 2020, 21, and 22, are basically double counted when we come up with this final ranking of 28th. But I've also worked this out year by year. So back in 2013, Michigan ranked 45th. But since then, the legislature has significantly increased funding, especially with the 2015 road funding bill. And as of 2022, we ranked 24th in the top half of states. So I've just presented a robust and objective way to assess states' road conditions and funding levels. Now, having these 2 data sets allows us to evaluate states' roads program performance, or how effectively or efficiently states use their available funds to achieve good system conditions. So we can plot these together. Here is our x-axis showing our road funding index. The y-axis is showing our system condition index. So we can see how system condition relates to road funding. And when I started this, I expected to find that when I plotted these together, there would be a trend line showing that more funding equals better roads. Pretty self-evident, right? Unfortunately, the data didn't cooperate. What I found was that, in fact, there is essentially no correlation. States that spend more aren't necessarily getting better results. And I was very skeptical of this finding, but I promise this holds up. I pulled this data apart and put it back together in a dozen different ways. I challenged the crap out of this. But as far as available data from the federal level, it shows fairly conclusively states that spend more on roads and bridges are no more likely to have better system conditions. Also, this doesn't really allow us to rank states by performance because there's two factors at play. So it sometimes becomes sort of a value judgment, right? So for example, we can look at Wisconsin. They've got better roads than Michigan, but they're spending more to get there. So from the perspective of a citizen taxpayer, would you rather be Wisconsin or Michigan? I don't know. But I think we can say we're doing better than Pennsylvania, who has only marginally better roads than Michigan, but is spending even more than Wisconsin to achieve that. And I think we're definitely doing better than Illinois, who is spending more than Michigan for lesser results. But critically, there are 20 states shown in this box that are spending about as much or less than Michigan and getting better results as far as road quality. So by this method of evaluation, it shows that we could be doing worse. But there's strong reason to believe that we could be doing better with the road funding we already have. So now we're going to focus on Michigan's road funding specifically. We just looked at funding at the national level, but that was sort of abstracted through that index scoring method, and the most recent data was from 2022. Another thing about federal reporting is that it goes through a lot of steps from when it's collected to when it's reported by the feds, and we can evaluate it. And states are different enough that it's not always clear how appropriate that comparison is. So it's not the most precise data, but if we want to look across states, it's really all we have to work with. But if we're only looking at Michigan, it's better to go straight to the source. So now I'm going to show you a totally different analysis using data directly from the state. And I'm going to frame this around the new road funding package. This package was passed last October. It created some new roads funding, also repealed some old roads funding, and you might be familiar with the idea that this package provided about $1 billion in additional funding by 2026, ramping up to just over $2 billion by 2030. And these numbers are basically the same as what's been reported by everyone else, because this is based on the legislative fiscal analyses. Now here's the rub. The state fiscal analyses provide sort of an accounting narrative from the perspective of the state annual budget, subject to a series of assumptions. But this framework doesn't entirely accurately reflect how funding will work in the real world. So the next few slides I'm going to show you will adopt this framework, but then we're going to double back and talk about how that is problematic. So keep in mind that this chart and others that I'm about to show you reflect state fiscal year budget accounting, not necessarily real world funding. This puts that funding in a historical context. So this chart is showing Michigan's road program funding history going back to 2007 and projected forward to 2031. The biggest caveat here is that these numbers don't include any local road funding. So all of those county millages and public works budgets are invisible to us here. And there are some other caveats, especially with future projections, which you can read all about in our recent report, which is linked down here. However, if you want to understand how much Michigan has spent on roads and bridges through the state program, including federal aid, this is the most useful analysis available. There's really no other source that has brought together data like this, probably because, one, this takes a lot of work, but moreover, to look at this, you have to go beyond typical accounting practices. For example, I'm showing bond expenditures together with revenue in this chart, and you usually won't see these together because bond funding is not in the budget. What is in the budget is debt service for bond funding, which I've removed from this chart because those funds are then not available for road work. Also, I'm trying to focus specifically on roads program funding rather than all transportation funding. So, for example, in 2025, our transportation budget, our state budget, was about $6.8 billion. I'm showing our nominal funding, this lower line, not including bond funding, as $5.26 billion because I've taken out transit and aeronautics and some other weird stuff. But so anyway, this is the best available estimate on what Michigan actually spends on roads and bridges through the state program. And at least in nominal terms, revenue has been increasing pretty steadily for over a decade. That's in part because of some general fund earmarks starting in 2013. Also, federal funding has increased somewhat. But the biggest impact has been from the 2015 transportation funding program. One thing that our 2015 roads funding bill did was index revenue to inflation in a couple of ways. So our nominal funding has kept increasing. Of course, that inflation that gives us more revenue also makes road work more expensive. So if you want to know how much road work we've been able to fund with this money, we need to adjust for inflation. And this is also a little bit of a better analysis than you've seen elsewhere, because I tried to capture real costs borne by road agencies by combining highway construction cost inflation with the standard consumer price index. So if you were just to adjust for inflation by CPI, which is how it's usually done, it would be different numbers, but that doesn't capture what we actually need to spend on roads to put pavement down. Highway construction cost inflation almost always runs hotter. So if you look at these first 5 years, while our nominal funding was flat, we actually lost 24% in purchasing power. And we didn't get back up to 2007 levels until 2019. Then there was pandemic era inflation, which kept our purchasing power about flat, even though our nominal funding was increasing during that period. We did have the Rebuilding Michigan Bond Program, which brought us up by more. So if we take this total figure of $5.71 billion for 2025, which includes our bond funding and federal aid, when the new road funding package fully kicks in, we will have increased by about 15%. Now that 15% figure is a little bit lower than what you usually hear. Again, that's because I'm comparing it to our total spending, including bond funding and federal aid, as well as adjusting for anticipated inflation. So here's what our inflation adjusted funding looks like if we focus only on state revenue sharing. So this removes that federal aid and bond funding, but since we remove that bond funding, it adds back in the debt servicing because we have to now think about how we're paying for those bonds. So by fiscal 27, after our 2025 transportation funding package, we will have increased real funding through state roads revenue by about 35%, which is quite significant. And that number is even a little bit higher than what you've heard elsewhere, even though I've adjusted for anticipated inflation. And that's because there are a couple $100 million per year in new funding that will be going to local grant programs. And in the way that the state parses that out, they've often taken that out. I've made some assumptions about how those grants will be distributed and included that here. So from 2025 to 2027, we're looking at a 35% increase. And this is a 93% increase over our 2012 fiscal 2012 low point. So in about 15 years, and again, this is adjusted for construction cost inflation. So through our state program, we're looking at nearly twice as much pavement, twice as much road work as we can do compared to 15 years prior. Here's another way of looking at that same data. Here we're looking at the relative change in state funding compared to our base year 2007. I've also extended this out to 2040 using reasonable assumptions, all else being equal. And it is really fraught to project out into the future this far. All else is never equal and weird stuff happens. But I wanted to give a sense of how much long-term impact the 2025 road funding package would have on our state program. And this gives us an idea that this could be a fairly long-term solution. These two lines up here, this is our local program funding, counties, cities, and villages. And even by 2040, with no new funding legislation and inflation tamping down on the purchasing power, we're still going to be at historically high funding levels. MDOT as well, there will be a couple years where by 2040, MDOT's funding levels were below where they might have been in a couple years. This also does not include the Rebuilding Michigan bond funding. So if you include actual expenditures going out, those numbers for MDOT would be up here somewhere in recent years. But this new road funding package, if it works the way as intended, is a lot of money sustained over the next couple of decades. So here's the part where I double back and tell you that nothing that I've just told you is entirely accurate. So I've presented the 2025 transportation funding package in the way that I think the legislature intended for it to work and the way that it could work from the perspective of standard public accounting practices applied to the state fiscal year budget. But as far as how money actually flows, it's not going to work that way. There is some uncertainty in the revenue that will be collected, as well as certain procedural issues that will impact the distribution timing of that revenue. So first, you're probably aware that the new marijuana wholesale tax, which is intended to provide about $420 million annually to roads, that is now being challenged in court. Now, the state won the first step. The industry plaintiffs were denied a preliminary injunction, so that tax will be collected. But that was only the first step in what could be a long-term process. And since this is a brand new tax, the Treasury is still trying to figure out how to collect and distribute it. Even though the taxes that reflect the 2026 fiscal year will be collected, they likely won't be collected until the 2027 fiscal year. Further, until the legal challenges are completely resolved, the Treasury may just decide to hold that in escrow until it is certain that it will be legal to distribute that for roads funding. Honestly, we really don't know how this is going to work yet. The Treasury has not given us much advice on what they plan to do, but it's nearly certain that whatever is available won't be distributed to road agencies within fiscal 26, even though that's reflected in the fiscal 26 budget. The other new pot of money is from a new corporate income tax earmark. And this is anticipated to provide about $688 million exactly $688 million in fiscal 26 and ramp up to over $1 billion by 2030. However, that earmark, through the way that the legislation is written, only becomes available once 1.25 billion of other priority uses are funded, mostly the general fund. There's also a housing fund in there. So here is our corporate income tax revenue history. The roads funding earmark does not come into effect until we get to this line. And for fiscal 26, we won't get the full earmark until we get to this line. Now, for what it's worth, the state has estimated that we will exceed that revenue in fiscal 26. So we will get the full, they're estimating that we will get the full earmark. But also for what it's worth, a year ago, in January 2025, the state estimated that the fiscal year 2025 revenues would be about $500 million higher than they actually came in. So there is some potential that these projections might be optimistic. There's also a timing issue. Assuming that this earmark does become available, and I'm fairly certain that at least some of it will become available, maybe the entire earmark will be credited, but it's unclear when the Treasury will deposit this in this new neighborhood roads fund. If the Treasury is being prudent, they won't credit the roads fund until they're certain that those other priority uses, the general fund and that housing fund, are already funded. So even though this revenue, again, this will be credited to the state fiscal 26 budget, it may not get to road agencies until the following year. And that also holds true for future years. It's going to be an issue every year with when the Treasury decides to credit the neighborhood roads fund, when they have to make sure that those other priority uses, particularly the general fund, get what they need through state law. And the Treasury so far has given us really no information about how they plan to deal with this. This is all new for them, and this issue was kind of thrown at them a few days into this fiscal year in October because of the way this year's fiscal year budget worked. So here's what we know about how the funding package has affected state roads revenue sharing so far in this fiscal year. Overall funding is down. Why? Because the legislature repealed a $600 million personal income tax earmark, which was effective immediately in the fiscal year. So that reduces funding every month, but the new revenue that they made available won't be realized until later. So thus far, road revenues, our revenues to our Michigan Transportation Fund are down about 15%. And the funding that is going out to road agencies has dropped even farther due to some one-time earmarks and weird budget stuff. Year over year monthly distributions, so remember our fiscal year begins in October, monthly distributions were down year over year, 16% in October and 19% in November. We don't have the December data yet. This is temporary. The increased fuel tax, which will fund the MTF at a higher level, kicked in as of January 1st, 2026. However, that new revenue has to work its way through the system. That won't get to road agencies until an April 3rd distribution. So in fiscal 26, we're going to have 6 months of reduced funding, followed by 6 months of increased funding. I haven't completely worked this out yet, but it looks like by the end of fiscal 26, looking only at the Michigan Transportation Fund, it's going to work out about evenly to fiscal 25. Might be a little bit more, a little bit less. I'm still working on that. And all this is assuming that we won't get any of that neighborhood road fund revenue. We might get some of that corporate income tax revenue in this fiscal year in the final months, but I wouldn't assume that just yet. And I would probably bet against it. I think that's probably going to be held off until fiscal 27 in terms of actual distribution that goes to road agencies. even though if you look at like, you know, our budget, what's included in our budget for fiscal 26, it will be included there, but road agencies probably are not going to get that. So the final thing I want to talk about, I received some preliminary questions about like what would a sustainable road funding approach for Michigan look like. First, unfortunately, so there's really no such thing as a fully sustainable funding approach. We saw our budget data with the new 2025 transportation funding package projected out until 2040, and it looks pretty good if that works as intended. So that'll be a fairly long-term solution, but nothing this complex is set it and forget it. We're going to be talking about road funding for the rest of our lives. You know, we've been talking about road funding forever. That's not going to end. This is a complex policy. You have to adjust things every once in a while. But we do have some options that we're currently not utilizing. I received a specific question about the potential for tolling. So in 2020, the legislature appropriated $3.3 million to study tolling specifically, and a report was published in 2023. I was really excited for the study to be done, but I was quite disappointed in the resulting report. I think MDOT, as the administrator of this study, kind of, they could have done a better job. So the approach, the whole analysis was based on a strategy to, quote, identify eligible bridges on toll corridors for the bridge tolling program. Then it was assumed that eligible bridges along a specific corridor would be tolled. I'm going to translate that, but first let me give you a little bit of background. So in federal law, you cannot turn a freeway that was constructed with federal funds into a tollway unless you completely reconstruct the entire road, like down to the subbase. And that kind of full depth reconstruction happens only about every 30 or 50 years or so. And if the freeway is an interstate route, you cannot turn it into a tollway even if you completely reconstruct it. There are some exceptions to this through special federal programs, but generally you can't turn a freeway into a tollway without a complete reconstruct, and on an interstate you can't even do that. However, you can rebuild existing bridges and then reopen them as tolled bridges, even on interstates. So MDOT's proposed strategy was to use this bridge program, rebuild a series of bridges along a highway corridor, and then toll that entire corridor as though it is a coherent tollway. So that struck me as illegal. And in fact, about the same time the study was published, the Federal Highway Administration updated one of their guidance documents. This is a little bit hard to interpret, but they're basically clarifying here that you can't apply a bridge toll to an entire section of highway as it could quote, create the risk of effectively tolling a federal aid highway that is not eligible to be tolled. And I think this was in direct response to MDOT's proposal. So the $3 million tolling study that legislature appropriated, I think was kind of a little bit of a waste of effort here. But there are other options. One thing that states are allowed to do is add toll lanes to existing highways, so long as you don't reduce the number of free lanes. So I think it's kind of unfortunate that in the last 10 or 15 years or so, MDOT's actually kind of added a lot of highway lanes, think like I-75, 94. Those could have been tolled lanes, but now that opportunity is gone. At the very least, I would say that moving forward, we should not be building any new highway lanes unless they are toll lanes. MDOT didn't evaluate this option in this study. I also mentioned that there are some special federal programs that could provide exceptions to these general prohibitions on federal tolling. The report didn't entirely overlook these options, but they weren't the focus. I discussed these a bit in this research brief, which is linked down here below. But anyway, all of this was studied. You can read all about it in this link here. This is the report that the state published. But this report didn't really give the legislature a viable way to move forward. And that said, when the legislature got this report, they kind of showed minimal interest. Even if this would have been a feasible strategy, I don't think it would have been acted on. Tolls really are not politically popular, and I don't have much reason to believe there's political will to do anything. Another hot topic for possible funding is called road usage charging. We call this RUC. This is typically discussed as an alternative to fuel taxes. I explored this in January of 2023. At that time, the legislature was considering funding a $6 million study on RUC. But the federal government and several states have been researching and piloting RUC for over 20 years now. So I wanted to make the point that if we were going to spend money on a study, we should be familiar with the existing literature so that we can design a research project that isn't just relearning things we already know. And we already know there are several technical, legal, and ethical problems with no clear solutions, especially when implemented at this state level. There are states that have implemented RUC. They are collecting revenue from a road usage charge, but those implementations are voluntary programs. People sign up for these voluntary programs because they are set up in a way such that participant volunteers are exempted from alternative registration fees and end up paying less. So the states that have implemented RUC are running revenue negative programs. They are losing money, not even considering additional administration costs. But anyway, Michigan went ahead and funded a study. Results were reported out last August. My takeaway from this study is that we learned basically nothing new except how Michiganders answer survey questions, but you can read all about it by clicking on this link and see if you can find any value. And in a few years, we'll have the results from an additional $7 million study, phase 2 study that was appropriated this year. Unfortunately, my personal opinion, I think this is kind of a dead end unless the federal government takes the lead to coordinate a national program. And unfortunately, there is very little movement there. While no states are generating funding through a road usage charge on light vehicles, 5 states have implemented a flavor of RUC on heavy trucks called a weight distance fee. And this is exactly what it sounds like. Trucking companies pay a fee or tax based on the loaded vehicle weight and how much they drive. I did some rough math and estimated we could generate at least $100 million in annual revenue, probably 2, maybe 3 times that, with a fee that's modest enough not to really impact the economics of the industry. And this is a really elegant solution. This is great policy because it actually correlates fees with costs imposed to the system. Trucks cause pavement damage. We can measure that. We can apply fees, and it's very easy to implement on these commercial vehicles because they already track the weights that they're carrying and the mileage that they travel. I suspect the only reason this isn't more popular is because the trucking industry lobbies against it. Also, road agencies aren't often on board because, especially in Michigan, they're the ones that run these very overweight gravel trains. So the opposition tends to successfully stop this approach. I published this research brief in 2024, and the only attention it really received was from the railroad industry. If we look past the state roads program to local agencies, local programs could be better and more fairly funded by local option taxes. Michigan law often preempts local authority here. This hasn't been a focus of my research. I borrowed this slide from our president, Eric Lufer, so I'm not going to say much about this except to note that this is an option used in other states, and I don't see an obvious reason for state policy to prohibit local governments from employing these funding options. And this is actually one of probably several reasons to argue for broader tax reform in Michigan. A couple more options that have popped up, fees on retail delivery, like when you get an Amazon package, as well as ride-hailing services when you take an Uber. I haven't looked at these, but for completeness, I wanted to acknowledge they exist. Part of the reason I haven't really looked at these is because I suspect there's not a ton of revenue potential here. In the places where these fees are in place, I think the revenues tend to be dedicated mostly to regulating these industries as well as managing the negative externalities from these services. So I don't think there's a lot of road funding. There might be. It is an option to evaluate. Okay, so let's wrap this up. What did we learn? Michigan's roads are not the worst in the nation, but they're pretty bad by our method ranking 40th. And that is despite Michigan's funding being better than we usually think, ranking 28th. And that performance gap might be a little surprising unless you look at the national data, which shows pretty conclusively states that get more funding are no likely to have better system conditions. And again, I'll note, I challenged the hell out of that finding. It holds up. States that get more funding are no more likely to have better roads. Regardless, the 2025 road funding bill will give us significantly more funding, but a lot of that funding will be delayed if it comes at all. There is some uncertainty, and that is going to cause a lot of planning problems for Michigan's road agencies, especially in fiscal 26, which we are now in the 4th month of fiscal 26. There are some valid options to get more funding in the future, but I think the most viable options aren't currently being seriously discussed in Michigan. And I'm right about where I wanted to land on time. Again, I'll send Carrie a copy of these slides to send out to you. You're also welcome to email me if there's anything I can help you with, or if you want to challenge me on anything, that would be great. I'm always looking for critical, informed feedback. I also want to mention, again, there are very few organizations that conduct this kind of nonpartisan public policy research free from any underlying agenda or advocacy position, probably because it's very difficult to get funding for this kind of research. So if you found this valuable, please consider supporting our work with a tax-deductible donation. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. And I know you answered a lot of the questions that I sent over to you that we discussed last week. There was one thing I wanted to just flag. I wasn't sure if you covered it and I missed it, but discussion of like the advantages of raw materials here in Michigan. Do we have an advantage over other states as far as like aggregates and other things where we can actually provide for ourselves?
I don't have much to say about that. So I've never been a materials engineer, or I've never designed like a road cross section really, except for, running a boilerplate cross section down a center line. One thing I can say, this isn't actually the slide I wanted. One thing I can say, so we do have some data about the relative cost of roadway base materials from 2015 to 2023. And so that's this blue dotted line with triangles. And what this is showing, Michigan's actually done a highway construction cost index using MDOT bid final bids. Western Michigan University did this. And the cost inflation on roadway base materials, which is sand and aggregates, from 2015 to 2023 has run higher than everything else. Another thing that I can say is that Michigan ranks 2 or 3 nationwide in states that export aggregate materials. So we produce a lot of it. For some reason, the costs internally have increased, but there's could be a lot more going on. I'm not sure how well what we produce matches what we need with roads, or where we produce it matches with where we need to do road construction. So there are a lot of things to look at there, which if you click on some of the links in this presentation, I touch on, but I've never really focused on this. So I can't give, that's about the best answer I can give. If somebody wants to email me a more specific question, I can dig into my research files and see if I can answer it better.
Well, thank you. I was just checking in our Q&A box and I don't see any other additional questions, but I just want to give everybody another chance. If they have some questions that they'd like to ask Eric, we're happy to address those, but also extremely grateful for the time you took to put into this and customizing it for our presentation, just based on your report, but also going a lot deeper into the discussion. And I look forward to sharing this presentation with everybody on the call. Do you have any other words of wisdom that you want to share with us?
No, if there's any, if anybody has, so as I said, I will share these slides with you, Carrie, in PDF form, and there are hyperlinks scattered throughout. And as well, if you want to do another solicitation for questions, once people receive these slides and send them to me, I would be happy to respond. Maybe you can roll that up and put that into a follow-up document for your clients. I really like answering specific questions. Very often in my research, I'm answering questions that I think are important, but I'm not sure if anyone cares. So sometimes it feels like I'm shouting into a void. So if I get a question and I know that somebody actually cares about that, I like putting in the time to give as specific and precise of an answer as I can.
Absolutely. So we'll certainly follow up with you after this gets distributed to everybody, and we look forward to any additional questions as everyone has a chance to review the material. But as always, we really appreciate the work that the CRC does and look forward to many more great reports this year and in the coming years as well. And I'll turn it over to you, Eric.
Yeah, just once again, thanks for having us. We really find internal value in doing this work, digging deeper than just the top line numbers or some of the basic ratios that Eric talked about in his presentation. And, we're interested, besides feedback on the report, interested in any other topics that the audience might want us to dig into. We're thinking about some of the data centers and how that plays out, and water infrastructure issues like that. So
I see somebody
interested
with
to
their
see that.
hand up. Do you mind if I allow a person to ask you a random question? I have Ken Holbert with a hand up. Ken, I'm going to push the button and hopefully this works.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, a great presentation. Really appreciate all the effort going into this. It's interesting how funding is not directly tied to improvements. So more funding does not necessarily equal better roads, which gets into my question. I'm a civil engineer, construction engineer by trade with, 30, going on 33 years with MDOT construction. And having the heaviest truck weights in the country, it's amazing to me how the industry, the contracting side of the industry, will, with their dying breath, argue that the heaviest trucks in the country have nothing to do with our road condition. Politically or legislatively, is there a chance that ever? I hear it gets brought up all the time, and it's a one-line conversation. It gets brought up and then immediately dies. Is there any chance that that ever gets addressed? Those truck weights come down and our road life gets extended. Our research would, the numbers would drive you to believe that lower truck weights are going to, exponentially extend road life. But is there any chance or any research that you've done that's ever been presented to the legislators that would potentially sway them or get them to believe it at least?
So it would be hard, because we have had these unique truck weight laws for so long. And so a lot of the industry processes are based around that. I think what might be easier is to actually start with deriving revenue from those overweight trucks. And so that's why I focused, on rather than reforming our truck weight laws first, applying that's not it either, a truck weight distance fee, so that we know where these overweight trucks are traveling, and we could actually derive revenue from that and apply that revenue to the roads where the trucks are causing the most damage. And this is being done elsewhere, even in some fairly tax conservative states like Kentucky and New Mexico. Like I mentioned, I think this is a really elegant policy because it actually matches costs imposed to the system with fees imposed to the industry. And so I would encourage you, I explored that in some detail in this research brief. So when you get the slides, I would encourage you to check out the link at the bottom here.
I absolutely will. Thank you very much for putting that together. And just last week, I was at the MITA conference and I asked the same question to one of the lobbying firms legislatively, and they kind of laughed and said, "Well, it's been talked about for 40 years, and it's always just a quick one-line conversation." So, but I'll keep fighting a good fight, so as long as I can. So,
Thank you.
thanks for the presentation again. Very well assembled and very informative. Thanks again.
Well, thanks for asking the question too. We really appreciate having interactive dialogue with the clients, and we are actually coming to the end of the time for this webinar, and we look forward to additional feedback after we distribute the slides, and appreciate everybody's time today to have this conversation.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you all.